The document was 40 pages long and written in the dry, careful language that diplomats used when they wanted to say something dangerous without sounding dangerous. Oran had read thousands of documents like it over his career. He had never felt his hands go cold reading one before. He set it on his desk and looked at the ceiling of his office aboard Conclave Station Meridian. Outside his viewport, a gas giant rolled in slow orange silence. He had always found it calming. Right now it did nothing for him. The document was a formal territorial demand. It came from the Gorathi Dominion, submitted that morning through official conclave channels. It was polite, thoroughly polite. It thanked the conclave for its time, acknowledged the complexity of interstellar relations, and then stated plainly that the two human colony worlds in the Ardent Reach were to be transferred to Gorathi administrative authority within 90 standard days. It called humanity a small and developing species. It called the transfer a mutual opportunity. It used the word cooperative 4 times. Oran read it twice more. Then he sent a session request to the full conclave chamber. The chamber filled within the hour. 47 species, represented by ambassadors and their staff, filled the curved rows of seats that rose from the central floor like a stone bowl. The Gorathi delegation sat on the far left. High Speaker Duvak was at their head. He was large even by Gorathi standards, with wide flat shoulders and a face that had learned to look patient while thinking of other things. Oran stood at the central podium and read the demand aloud. He did not editorialize. He simply read it, word by word, including the part about mutual opportunity. When he finished, the chamber sat quiet for a moment. Then Duvak spoke. He said that the Gorathi had reviewed humanity's galactic profile extensively. He said that humans occupied a relatively small number of systems, maintained a modest fleet, and had a history of preferring negotiation to conflict. He said this as though it were a kindness, as though he were explaining why the target was reasonable. He said the Gorathi expected the conclave to facilitate a smooth process. Oran looked across the chamber. He noted, without expression, that 3 of the oldest serving council members had gone very still, not tense, not alarmed, still in the way that people went still when they already knew how a story ended. The human ambassador sat in the 3rd row. His name was Rael. He was not young, not old, built like someone who spent time outdoors and did not talk about it. He had been humanity's senior conclave representative for 11 years, and in that time had negotiated 7 trade agreements, 2 border resolutions, and 1 hostage situation that the official record described only as resolved without incident. He raised his hand. Oran recognized him. Rael stood, straightened his jacket, and asked if he could respond to the High Speaker. Duvak gestured for him to proceed, generously. Rael did not look at Duvak. He looked at his own small data screen, scrolled briefly, and then began to read. He was reading from a Gorathi internal strategic document, dated 12 years prior. It had been declassified by accident during a trade filing error 3 years ago and quietly entered into the conclave public record. It called humanity a non-threatening species. It described humans as unlikely to escalate under economic or territorial pressure. It projected that humans would respond to assertive negotiation with concession. Rael read the relevant sections in a flat voice. He did not change his tone. He did not add commentary. When he was done, he set the screen down. He said only, "I want the conclave to have this document in mind during whatever process follows." He sat down. Duvak's expression had not changed. He said that old assessments were products of their time and that the Gorathi position remained as stated. Oran called a recess before anything further was said. In the corridor outside the chamber, Oran stood near a wide viewport and watched the gas giant. The orange light shifted slowly across the station walls. Behind him, he could hear the sound of various delegations murmuring to each other, the particular low sound of people recalculating. One of the three still council members walked past him. Her name was Sova, and she had represented the Lethri people for longer than Oran had been alive. She was small, gray-feathered, and moved with the economy of someone who had stopped wasting energy on unnecessary things decades ago. She paused beside him. Oran said, quietly, that he was not sure what the correct procedural response was to a demand of this kind. Sova looked at the gas giant. She said that the procedure was not the part he should be thinking about. He asked her what she meant. She said she would tell him later, in private, not here. Then she walked on. Oran stayed at the viewport. Down the corridor, the Gorathi delegation was gathered in a loose group. They were talking among themselves, low and confident, and one of them laughed at something. The laugh was easy, comfortable, the laugh of people who had done their math and found it favorable. Oran watched them. He thought about the document Rael had read. He thought about the three council members who had gone still. He thought about the way Rael had said, "I want the conclave to have this in mind," and the way that sentence had felt less like a diplomatic note and more like a timestamp. The gas giant turned. The Gorathi laughed again. Oran picked up his files and went back to work. The archive room was at the far end of the station's administrative wing, past the water processing units and two sets of blast doors that no one had opened for an emergency in 6 years. It smelled like old climate control and dry paper, which was unusual because there was no paper in it. Oran had never understood that. He had stopped questioning it. Sova was already there when he arrived. She had pulled a chair close to the record terminals and was sitting with her hands folded, looking at nothing in particular. A cup of something warm sat on the table beside her. She had not touched it. She told him to close the door. He closed the door. She did not start with the Gorathi. She started somewhere else. She said, 31 years ago, a species called the Keth Confederation seized a human mining platform in the outer band of the Delvos system. The platform had 41 workers on it, 41 civilians. The Keth wanted system access rights that were under negotiation. They took the platform as leverage. Oran had heard of the Keth, medium-sized civilization, methodical. They had a strong trade network and were considered reliable partners in the Conclave's eastern sectors. Sova said the Keth did what most species would do in that situation. They sent terms. They said the workers were unharmed. They said they would remain that way as long as talks progressed. They were, by their own lights, being reasonable. Oran asked what happened. Sova said the human response arrived in 96 hours. Not a negotiation team, not a legal filing. Every Keth military asset in the Delvos system went offline simultaneously. Not destroyed, disabled. Every ship, every station weapon, every communication relay that carried military signal. The Keth later described it as watching lights go out one by one across a map, except all the lights went out at once. The 41 workers were on a human rescue craft within 4 hours of that. The only message humanity sent the Keth was 7 words. Return to your borders, this is done. The Keth did. The Keth have never raised a weapon in a human direction since, and they never explained to any other species exactly what happened in those 96 hours, because the honest answer was that they did not fully know. Sova picked up her cup, looked at it, set it down again. She said, the Gorathi have reviewed human fleet numbers. They have counted ships. They have read patrol reports and response times and measured the distance between human colony worlds. They have done what every species does when it looks at another species. They measured what they could see. Oran said he understood the point. Sova said he did not quite. She said the dangerous thing was not that the Gorathi underestimated humanity. Underestimation was common. The dangerous thing was that the Gorathi had specifically concluded that humans preferred to negotiate. That was true. Humans did prefer to negotiate. What the Gorathi assessment had failed to ask was what humans did after negotiation was no longer the available option. Oran sat with that for a moment. He asked if there were other incidents besides the Keth. Sova listed 4 more. She named them plainly without drama. A border incursion by the Pelari that ended when the Pelari fleet found itself unable to move for 6 hours and arrived home to find their staging base empty of fuel cells. A hostage situation involving human researchers taken by a private Drovan faction, resolved in 11 hours, after which the faction dissolved and none of its leadership could be located for comment. A trade blockade by the Ulmani that lasted 9 days before 3 of their largest cargo stations suffered simultaneous and complete power loss. The Ulmani restored power after a week. They dropped the blockade. They sent a formal apology. All of these were in the Conclave record. None of them were in the section labeled Conflicts. They were in the section labeled Resolved Disputes. Oran asked who decided to put them there. Sova said the humans had requested that categorization each time. They considered the matters closed and preferred not to make them into official confrontations. They had been, in each case, given what they asked. He stared at the floor for a while. Sova said, "The older species on this council have learned to read the pattern. When a new species rises and reaches a certain level of confidence, it begins to look at humanity and see a soft target. Something manageable. The fleet numbers, the quiet history, the preference for talking. It adds up to a picture that looks like a species that can be moved." She said, and sometimes we warn them, and they listen or they don't. The Gorathi are not going to listen. She had watched Duvak's face during Rael's reading. She knew that face. It was the face of someone who had already decided for whom data was a formality. Oran asked what came next. Sova said that the Gorathi would make a move. Humans would respond, and then the Gorathi would have the information they needed. She finally drank from her cup, made a small face. It had gone cold. She said, "The saddest part is that humans will probably still offer them a way out. They usually do." Oran said that did not sound sad. It sounded generous. Sova looked at him. She said, "It is generous. That is what makes it sad, because some of them don't take it." Sen had been flying for 8 years and she had never once questioned a mission. That was not stubbornness. That was not blind obedience. It was simply that she had always trusted the intelligence. The intelligence was always thorough. The intelligence said humans were manageable. She sat at the head of her strike wing aboard the Gorathi light cruiser Persistent Answer and watched Ardent Station grow on her forward display. It was a human colony hub, trade processing, light manufacturing, a population of around 12,000. Big enough to matter, small enough to take without a sustained campaign. General Voss had called this a demonstration, a show of intent. 3 warships crossing into human territory and broadcasting authority was enough, he said. Humans would respond through channels. They would file a protest. There would be talks. That was what humans did. Sen thought about this as her wing fell into standard holding formation around the other 2 cruisers. She thought it sounded right. She ran the numbers herself. 3 armed Gorathi cruisers against a colony station with a light defense grid. The math was not complicated. The cruiser broadcast its signal on all open channels. The message was direct. Ardent Station and surrounding space were now under Gorathi administrative jurisdiction. All vessels were to hold position. Station command was to transmit acknowledgement. Sen waited. What came back was not a distress signal. It was not a panic demand for the message to be repeated. It was an automated acknowledgement, calm and system-generated, the kind of response that ports used for routine traffic updates. It said message received, response to follow. Sen stared at the words for a moment. She checked her sensors. Standard sweep. She looked at the space around Ardent Station, at the approach corridors, at the standard transit lanes. Then her proximity board lit up. Not red. Not alarm. Just new contacts appearing on her left flank, filling in one after another like someone placing chips on a board. Her sensor display updated the count 3 times in 4 seconds. 14 human vessels. Battle configuration, already in position. Already there, not coming there. She had not seen them arrive because they had not arrived during her watch. They had been waiting. She did not know since when. She opened a channel to the other Gorathi cruisers. Both had the same readings. No one said anything for a moment. Then the human channel opened. The voice that came through was male, unhurried, the tone of someone giving directions they had given before and expected to give again. He said his name was Commander Hale. He said they were in human space. He said he was going to ask them to leave once. Just once. Sen reported back to Voss. She described the contacts, their positioning, the fact that they had been on station before the Gorathi wing arrived. She described the message. She used flat language and accurate numbers. Voss told her to hold position. He said 14-3 was a difficult engagement but not an impossible one. He said to wait for the reinforcement wing he was already calling up. He said that humans were testing them, that this was a show of their own, that backing down now would cost the Dominion credibility in the conclave. Sen held position. On her display, the 14 human ships did not move. They did not power weapons, or rather, her sensors showed power in all weapon systems but no targeting locks on Gorathi hulls. She checked twice. No locks. They were sitting there, armed, watching, not pointing anything at anyone. She found that more unsettling than if they had pointed everything at her. She spent the next 22 minutes watching them not move and thinking about what that meant. They were not nervous. They were not posturing. They were waiting in the way that a closed door waited. There was no effort in it. Commander Hale did not call again. The reinforcement wing came out of transit 40 minutes later. 30 Gorathi vessels now. She watched her formation double, then triple. She felt the familiar confidence of numbers returning. 30-14. The math was very different. Then her sensor board updated. She watched without moving as her display revised. The 14 human ships were still there. Around them, between them, behind them, and to the sides, more contacts resolved out of background static. Ships that had been running low-emission holds, she realized. Running quiet in the traffic lanes. Parked in the debris shadows of a nearby asteroid field. Already there. The number climbed past 30, past 40, settled at 47. Still no targeting locks, still no aggressive signal. Sen opened a private channel to Voss. She made sure her voice was level before she spoke. She had trained for this. She said, "The human count has updated." She gave him the number. There was a pause on Voss's end that lasted longer than it should have. He asked her how many ships the humans had in this sector in total. She looked at her board. She thought about the ones that had been there before she arrived. She thought about the ones that had simply appeared. She thought about the ones that might still be sitting quiet in places her sensors had not thought to look. She said, "I don't know. I don't think we can see all of them." Another pause. She waited. Outside her viewport, Ardent Station turned slowly in the pale light of its sun. Inside, 12,000 people were going about whatever they did on an ordinary day. Not evacuating, not panicking, just living. As if they knew something she didn't. The battle started the way bad decisions usually do. Not with a plan, with someone running out of patience. A Gorathi cruiser captain whose name does not appear in any conclave record because the Gorathi removed it from their official accounts afterward, made the call without authorization. He fired on the human formation because he had been sitting still for 3 hours and the silence was worse than action. He fired 2 volleys, targeting the nearest human ship, and for a brief moment he probably felt better about things. The first volley missed. Human ships did not move the way Gorathi targeting systems expected. They slid sideways, not back, cutting across the line of fire at angles that forced recalculation. The second volley was partially blocked by a small human escort that put itself between the cruiser and the larger vessel in a move that looked, to every Gorathi watching, either suicidal or very well rehearsed. The escort took the hit. It vented atmosphere from a rear section. It did not break formation. Commander Hale's voice came over the open channel 2 seconds later. He said the Gorathi had made the first strike. He said the offer to leave had expired. He said nothing else. What happened next was described afterward by several Gorathi crew members in debriefs as feeling like being in a room where all the furniture suddenly knew what it was doing. Human ships did not fight in lines. They did not hold formation in any way the Gorathi tactical training covered. They broke into small groups that communicated in ways Gorathi signal analysts could hear but not decode fast enough. A group of 3 would pull a Gorathi cruiser's attention, draw its fire, pull back, and the moment the cruiser adjusted, 2 different human ships were already coming from the side. Not from where they had been. From where they had moved to, while the cruiser was looking the other way. 3 Gorathi cruisers went dark in the first 40 minutes, not destroyed. Their hulls were intact, their crews unharmed. Their engines were offline and their weapons were cold and they were drifting. The human formation had disabled them with the minimum force needed and then moved on to other targets. Hale broadcast to the disabled ships. Escape pods would not be targeted. Crew that needed medical help could signal for it. Rescue would come after the engagement concluded. Voss, watching from his command ship at the rear of the Gorathi formation, felt the shape of the battle changing in a way he did not have language for yet. He tried to push 2 flanking groups forward. One was met by human ships that had somehow crossed the distance faster than his sensors had predicted. The other made it 3/4 of the way before its lead ship lost all propulsion and began drifting in a quiet circle. He sent a message to the conclave requesting intervention. He did not receive a reply. Later, he would learn this was because the message arrived during an emergency session being called by his own government's ambassador, who was simultaneously trying to claim the humans had started it. Nobody in that session was looking at the battle data yet. If they had been, they would have seen what Voss was seeing, that the human fleet was not winning by numbers. The numbers were significant, yes, but that was not the machinery at work. What was at work was something harder to count. The human ships seemed to know what the Gorathi were going to do slightly before the Gorathi did it. Not perfectly, not always. But often enough that Voss kept watching his tactical display, with the feeling that he was reading a book someone had already finished. Then the civilian transport was hit. It was not a military vessel. It was the Ardent Station Evacuation Transport, a broad, flat cargo and passenger ship that had been moving toward the outer edge of the system since the engagement began. It was marked with civilian signal codes on every frequency. It was white. It carried a population of 312 people, mostly families, mostly the very young and the very old. The station's non-essential personnel moved out of harm's way. A Gorathi cruiser whose targeting system was overwhelmed by 3 simultaneous engagements fired a widespread shot that was aimed at a human fighter. The fighter banked left. The shot did not. It hit the transport amidships. The transport's rear half went dark. It began to tumble. Voss saw it happen on his display. He saw the civilian codes. He closed his eyes. Aboard the human fleet command vessel, a crew member at the communications station read the incident data aloud. The bridge was quiet while she spoke. Fleet Admiral Nora stood at the forward display with her hands at her sides and listened to the full report. When it was done, she did not ask questions. She said, "All restraint protocols rescinded. Authorization Nora 7." The bridge crew moved. Voss watched his display and did not fully understand what had changed until 3 minutes had passed, and he counted the Gorathi ships that were now out of the fight. He had started with 30. The number that was still functional was less than half that, and it was dropping, and it was dropping faster than before. There were no more pauses, no more deliberate disabling shots that left hulls intact. The human fleet moved through the Gorathi formation the way a tide moved through sand, not violently, not with anger, with direction. He sent the order to fall back. Not all of his ships received it in time. The ones that did turned and ran. The human fleet let them go. Every single retreating Gorathi ship was allowed to leave. No pursuit. Not one shot fired at a ship that had turned away. Voss watched the battle end from the bridge of his own ship, which had not been targeted once. He did not understand that either, not yet. Voss had commanded ships for 22 years. He had studied 4 wars, observed 2, and participated in the kind of border exercises that were technically peaceful, but involved enough live ammunition that the distinction felt thin. He knew what the inside of a beaten fleet looked like. He had not expected to see it from the inside. His ship was not destroyed. His ship was untouched, which was its own kind of humiliation. The humans had looked at him and decided he was not worth engaging, and whether that was strategy or indifference he still could not determine. Around him, the Gorathi ships that had not escaped were drifting. Some of them were still running emergency lights. One of them was spinning very slowly in a way that suggested its stabilizers were gone, but its hull was intact. A human shuttle docked with his ship 4 hours after the engagement ended. He expected soldiers. He expected restraints and formal surrender procedures, and the particular controlled anger of people who had just watched a civilian transport get shot. What came through the airlock was 3 people. 2 of them carried medical bags. One of them was a woman who introduced herself as part of a humanitarian response team and asked him, in polite and simple language, whether any of his crew needed immediate medical attention. He said nothing for a moment. She waited. She did not look impatient. She looked the way someone looked when they were prepared to wait as long as was necessary. He told her that 2 of his crew had injuries from a pressure loss in one of the lower decks. She nodded and asked him to take her to them. He did. He walked her through his own ship. She followed, looked at things without touching them, and when they reached the 2 injured crew members, she directed her colleagues without drama, speaking in short, clear sentences. One of his crew had a broken arm. The other had burns on his neck and shoulder. She treated both. She did not ask for any information. She did not appear to want anything from him. When she was done, she told him that a formal processing shuttle would arrive within 6 hours. She told him that the crew of the civilian transport had been recovered, that the injured were receiving treatment, and that the current fatality count from the incident was 1. She said this carefully, with her eyes on him. 1 person had died on that transport. 1 person who had been trying to get away from something that should never have touched them. She did not raise her voice when she said it. She did not need to. He asked her why they were doing this, treating his crew, giving him information. She looked at him the way people looked at questions they found genuinely strange. She said because his crew were injured people, and the information was true. She left. Voss sat in his command chair for a long time after that. In the conclave chamber, the full session was loud in a way that full sessions rarely were. Ambassador Duvak was demanding intervention, demanding a formal condemnation of human aggression, demanding that the council acknowledge that the Gorathi had been responding to a provocation. He used the word unprovoked 4 times before Iran, who was managing the session, asked him to hold the floor for a response. Rael walked to the central podium. He had a data file. He set it on the podium. He did not open it immediately. He looked around the chamber in the way someone looked when they wanted to make sure they had everyone's attention before they said something that mattered. He said, "The Gorathi entered human sovereign space with armed warships and broadcast a claim of authority over a human civilian station. The first shot in the subsequent engagement was fired by a Gorathi captain, and that event is recorded in full across 27 independent sensor logs, including logs from neutral flag vessels transiting the outer system. He said this plainly. He said it once. He said humanity's response was calibrated. Ships were disabled rather than destroyed in the initial exchange. Retreat was permitted. At no point were Gorathi civilian systems targeted. At no point were escape pods or disabled craft fired upon. He said a Gorathi vessel fired on a civilian transport carrying 312 noncombatants. One person died. He said the name. He said it clearly, so it was in the record. He said, humanity has provided medical care to injured Gorathi crew members as of this hour. No Gorathi prisoners are being held under armed guard. We are processing, not detaining. Then he said, we stopped. We could have continued. He did not say what continued would have looked like. He did not need to. Everyone in that room had access to the battle data. Duvak tried to speak. Oran recognized 3 other speakers first. Each one said their piece briefly. The pattern that emerged was the same that Sova had described in the archive room, the pattern that some species recognized and others had to learn. Sova spoke last. She had not spoken at all during the session until that point, which meant Oran had learned that she had decided the rest needed to be said first. She described the Keth. She described the Pelari and the Drovan faction and the Ulmani. She described 4 other species by name, by incident, by outcome. She said that every one of them was still here. Every one of them had been offered a stop and had taken it. She said, humanity does not want territory. They do not want this war. They have demonstrated today and in 30 years of recorded history that what they want is to be left alone and to have their people safe. Everything else they are capable of is in service of that and nothing else. She said, the Gorathi should consider that they were allowed to retreat. They should consider what it means that their soldiers are being given medical care. They should consider what it would have looked like if humans had decided the demonstration needed to be complete. She said, I have seen 3 species learn this lesson. The learning is never comfortable, but it is better than the alternative. She sat down. Duvak did not speak again that session. The resolution took 9 days to finalize. That was fast, by conclave standards. Most resolutions of comparable weight took months, sometimes years, moving through subcommittees and draft revisions, and the particular slow friction of 47 species trying to agree on language. This one moved because nobody wanted to be slow about it. The final document held the Gorathi Dominion formally responsible for the territorial violation and the civilian strike. It mandated reparations to Ardent Station to be delivered over an 8-year schedule. It required a formal withdrawal from all human-adjacent space and a restructuring of Gorathi military conduct standards under conclave oversight. It did not take any Gorathi territory. It did not install any human authority over Gorathi systems. It did not put Gorathi citizens under any external governance. Duvak signed it. He signed it in the conclave chamber, in front of the full membership, and his face was a careful arrangement of composure that fooled nobody in the room. Rael signed on behalf of humanity and then reached across the table and offered his hand. Duvak shook it after a pause that was just long enough to be noticed and just short enough to be diplomatic. No one applauded. That was not a conclave custom. But when the session closed, the room was very quiet, and it was a different kind of quiet than it had been before. Voss left the station 2 days later. He was not detained beyond the processing period. His crew went home with him. At the departure gate, a human logistics officer handed him a data chip. It held the medical records for all Gorathi crew members treated during and after the engagement. Clean files, completely transferred. He looked at it for a moment and then put it in his coat without saying anything. He had, during the processing period, been given access to a small recreation space where several of his senior crew were also waiting. He had spent part of one afternoon sitting at a table across from a young human technician who had been assigned to monitor the communications equipment in the processing area. not a guard, a technician. She was maybe 22 years old. She was studying something on a small screen and eating what appeared to be a bread product with too much filling. She noticed him sitting across the room and asked, without particular caution, whether he wanted something to read. She had a fiction collection on her screen she was willing to share. She said some of it was translated into Gorathi Standard, she thought. He told her he was fine. She nodded and went back to her bread and her screen. He sat in that room for 2 hours, and in that time she spoke to him twice more. Once to tell him that the heating in the room was broken, and she could request a portable unit if he was cold. Once to ask if the chairs were comfortable for Gorathi build, because she could put in a request for different furniture. Both times he told her he was fine. Both times she nodded and went back to what she was doing. He thought about that on the transport home. He thought about the medical team on his ship. He thought about the allowed retreat, about being left alone on his command chair while the battle resolved around him. He thought about Commander Hale saying, "I am going to ask you to leave once," in that flat and honest voice, and how that sentence had not been a bluff or a show. It had been exactly what it was. He thought about a species that had the capacity to disable an entire fleet's military capability across a whole star system in 96 hours, and what it had chosen to do with that capacity, and why. He did not reach any comfortable conclusions, but he reached some true ones. Oran filed his report to the Conclave Oversight Committee on the evening the Gorathi delegation left. He wrote it in his own office, alone, with the gas giant outside his viewport doing what it always did, turning and turning in its deep orange silence. He wrote about the demand. He wrote about the vote. He wrote about the archive room and Sova's cold cup and the list of incidents that lived in the resolved disputes section of the Galactic Record. He wrote about the battle data and what it looked like to watch an engagement where one side kept choosing the minimum force required and the other side had not understood what minimum meant. At the end, he wrote about the civilian transport, about the one name that Rail had said out loud so that it was in the record. He wrote it again in his own report for the same reason. Then he wrote, "I interviewed crew members of the transport who were willing to speak. One of them was a cargo logistics worker. She had been on station transports for 19 years. She was not young. I asked her if she had been frightened when the Gorathi fired. She said yes, very frightened. I asked her what she thought when the human fleet changed. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, 'I thought good, now they know.' I asked her what she meant. She said, 'I meant that we were going to be okay, and they were going to understand something they didn't before. That's usually how it works.' I asked her how she knew it would work that way. She looked at me the way people looked when a question was very obvious to them, and they were deciding how to explain it. She said, 'Because we always try to stop before it becomes something we can't take back. We always try. That's the whole point.'" Oran closed his report. He looked out at the gas giant. A human diplomatic shuttle was moving away from the station now, heading for the transit corridor home. It was small against all that orange space. Quiet, moving without hurry. He watched it go. The warning was simple. It had always been simple. It did not need to be large or loud or decorated with threat. It simply needed to be true, and it was true, and every species that had gotten close enough to test it had eventually understood that. The shuttle reached the transit corridor and vanished. The gas giant turned. Oran turned off his lamp and went to bed.